It's cutdown day in the NFL. Let's talk about some of the key decisions facing the Jets as they trim their roster to 53 players. That's today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Tuesday, August 27th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from gangreennation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Well, the Jets face the roster deadline today. All 32 teams in the NFL must have their rosters down to 53 players by 4 p.m. Eastern. So the Jets have a lot of players they're going to have to cut today. Many of these players will ultimately end up on the Jets practice squad, but the Jets are cutting their roster from 90 players down to 53. They actually got a little bit of a head start yesterday. They cut a couple of guys, but a lot of decisions. And I always think it's a sad day on the NFL calendar because, on a human level, a lot of players are seeing their dreams of being an NFL player come to an end. But, it's a business, and the Jets need to pick the 53 best players to fill out their roster. So let's talk about some of the decisions facing the New York Jets. And I think the first thing I want to emphasize is it's easy to get carried away with how significant today is. I think that it's important to keep in context the choices the Jets are making. These are not franchise-altering decisions. I mean, I think sometimes we act like these decisions are just how can the Jets possibly make these decisions? How it's so tough to decide. These guys are all so good. How do we let one of these guys go? And you have to remember that you're not choosing between Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson here. You're not choosing between two core players. You're not choosing between, do we keep Sauce Gardner or do we keep Quinnen Williams? These are decisions that are made about guys at the very, very bottom of the roster. These are guys who, it's like player 48, player 49, 50, 51, 52, 53 versus 54, 55, 56, 57. And at the end of the day, most of these guys that are on the bubble, whether you keep them or whether you cut them, it's not going to make a big difference in the franchise's trajectory. And every year this day, there are these heated arguments about whether the Jets should have kept this guy or cut this guy. And I actually remember on my website, gangreennation.com, it was 9 years ago. It was the year 2015. And for days, there was this heated argument that went on over this choice the Jets made. They essentially chose one edge rusher over the other. It chose a guy the team had drafted in the 7th round the year before, Trevor Riley. He was out of Utah, over a veteran pass rusher, Jason Babbitt. And for days and days, there was this heated argument on my website about should the Jets have kept Riley or Babbitt, and there were people on both sides, and nonstop. How could they have cut Babbitt, or Riley's got a great future? And in reality, it didn't make a big difference. Riley never really amounted to anything, and Babbitt, who had a relatively productive career. I mean, he wasn't the greatest. He's not a Hall of Famer, but he had a couple decent pass rushing years. But his productive career was largely over at the point the Jets cut him. And the Jets got a decent season out of him in 2014, but he was kind of at the end of the line. And every year you see some version of that. That one sticks in my mind because that one got particularly heated. But you're dealing with guys who are on the roster bubble, and ultimately, guys on the roster bubble don't really tends to make a big impact. Yeah, there's the occasional guy, but like Danny Woodhead's a good example. The Jets, this guy was a very prolific college player out of Chadron State, a small school, and the Jets cut him in 2010. He went on to New England and was a decent player. He was like a pretty solid pass catching back, and you wouldn't have thought that was the end of the world. And Danny Woodhead was a decent player, and the Jets probably should have kept him, but it ultimately didn't make that big of a difference. It's not like Danny Woodhead going to New England made doomed the Jets franchise. So I think that it's very easy to get carried away with all this stuff. And look, occasionally there actually is a move that is significant. Sometimes there's a surprise cut of a productive player who you're expected to play a role on your team. And if the Jets do that, if there's some surprise cut of some guy we thought the Jets would be counting on this year, that's something worth discussing. If a few years down the line, one of the players the Jets cut ends up and turns out to be a good player elsewhere, then we can look back and say, why did they do that? We can start exploring why they did that. But ultimately, it's very rare that these moves end up moving the needle one way or the other. In fact, what most frequently happens on this day is people get really, really fired up over some decision, over some player the Jets cut. And people are convinced we're going to lose this guy because he's going to go on waivers and some other team's going to pick him up. And then none of the other 31 teams show much interest. And the guy ends up signing with the Jets practice squad the next day. And I guarantee you there's going to be a player like that today. Now, that's not to say, I have no preferences in what the Jets do. We're going to get to some of my Jets roster preferences in a little bit on the show. A guy like Leonard Taylor, who did a fantastic job in the preseason. It's not just that he produced. It's one thing. Sometimes you can be a prisoner to box score scouting in the preseason. You can see this guy really produced in the preseason. We should keep him around. That's not always the case because you're not going up against the greatest competition. And beyond the level of competition, you also have to remember that in the preseason, opponents are not typically game planning for you. In the preseason, everybody's just focused on their own evaluations because everybody's got to cut their roster from 90 to 53 guys down. So they can't really focus on the opponent. They're focusing on evaluating their own players. And they design, the way they approach the game like that. Once you get to the regular season, other teams are trying to attack your players' weaknesses. So these are holistic evaluations. Every single year, I mentioned this yesterday, every single year, there's some guy who's a star of the final preseason game. And that guy gets cut and people act shocked. But it's not just about like one game. It's also about a more holistic evaluation of not only what the guy, partially what the guy did in training camp and the preseason games that preceded the finale, but also just projecting how good the guy's going to be and whether the guy can withstand, the NFL season. A guy like Leonard Taylor, I think what he did is repeatable. Braden McGregor, I thought, look, he showed enough. I mean, look, his production was there. I'm not saying his production wasn't there. He showed enough that, he deserves a spot on the practice squad, if not the active roster, because he's a developed, guy you can develop. But his game needs development. He's not going to go up. I think a lot of McGregor's production in the game against the Giants was just him going up against lousy competition. And that's not a knock on McGregor because the fact he was able to beat that lousy competition shows that there's something there. It shows that there's talent. But I don't think he can use that technique and win. I think Leonard Taylor might be able to use the technique he showed against the Giants and win in the NFL. So the Jets let him go. I'd be a little annoyed. They'd be a little, and again, it's important to keep this in perspective. That's really the point I'm making, that I have preferences. And if the Jets, were to cut Leonard Taylor, I'd be a little concerned if he was exposed to some other team, a waiver claim by some other team. If some other team claimed him, I'd be a little concerned. I'm not going to panic. I'm not going to, go on to the Wednesday show fire and brimstone about how the Jets lost Leonard Taylor, but I would have some degree of concern. So it's just important to keep everything in perspective because the Jets have decisions to make, but these decisions are ultimately about the very back of the roster and typically not guys that the team's going to be counting on this season. It's more about who are we trying to develop, who can help us on special teams. And ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, I'm going to give you some preferences I have for the way the Jets build their roster. There are a couple of things that come to mind that I think could give the Jets a little bit of an edge as they pick their final 53. I'll tell you what they are as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. You hear me talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Well, today I have something a little different for you, and I think you'll like it. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 to get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. And look, if you live out of market, NFL Sunday Ticket's a must because Jets have a fair share of primetime games this year, but they're not all on primetime. And the Jets may not be shown every week in your area. That's where NFL Sunday Ticket comes in. You can watch all out-of-market games live. It's a fantastic product. It's improved, I think, tremendously since it moved to YouTube and YouTube TV last year. But even if you live in New York, you may want to see some other games. Week 1, the Jets are playing prime time. Week 3, the Jets are playing Thursday night football. So those Sunday afternoons open. Do you want to have to depend on Fox and CBS to show you the right games you want to watch? Or do you want to just pick which game you want to watch? You can watch any game on the schedule with NFL Sunday Ticket, and you get it through FanDuel because, again, FanDuel customers can bet $5 get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And tomorrow we will focus on the players the Jets select for their 53-man roster because today is Cutdown Day. So heading into Cutdown Day, I have a couple of thoughts on what I would like to see the Jets do. And I mentioned this briefly in our first segment. I'd like to see Leonard Taylor get a spot on the roster. And it's funny because all preseason, the last couple of weeks, I've been talking about Leonard Taylor because he really impressed us week 1 in preseason against Washington, quiet week 2 against Carolina, then impressed us again week 3 against the Giants. And I think that the theory behind keeping Taylor for much of the preseason has been concerned that the Jets may not be able to get him onto the practice squad, that some other team would claim him. And I've been a skeptic of that idea, and I still am kind of a skeptic of that idea from the standpoint that, and I don't think we talk enough about this, there are going to be like 1,200 players cut, and I just don't think teams have enough manpower to thoroughly scout all the preseason games. And I think that there are less waiver claims than probably there should be, just because of the sheer volume of players who hit the waivers. And ultimately, teams may not be aware of how Leonard Taylor's playing. I mean, they can see the stats, but I don't know that a box score is really going to drastically change your evaluation of a player unless you watch him on film. And Leonard Taylor was a non-drafted free agent, so there were some teams that most of the teams probably did not think all that highly of him. For me, it's not so much a fear that he's going to get claimed, although I am a little worried about it. It's just more, I think he's earned a spot on the roster. I think that if you're looking at the best 53-man roster for the Jets, he's probably on it. I mean, I look at this defensive tackle position for the Jets, and we have an absolute superstar in Quinnen Williams, but after him, I don't know that it's that great. I mean, you've got Javon Kinlaw. I mean, I think the Jets are kind of hoping Kinlaw is like a successful reclamation project. After that, Leki Fatu, he's not that great. Solomon Thomas is a good locker room guy, but, he's not all that productive. And it's like I said, from watching Taylor, I feel like, he's winning he's not just overwhelming other guys because he's bigger and stronger and more athletic. He's winning because he's using good technique. And to me, that's the type of thing that's repeatable. That's the type of thing that suggests maybe he can be a good rotational guy here. I don't want to put too much on him, but I think there's a chance that, I'm not going to say outside chance, I think there's a chance he could be a decent rotational guy year 1, which if you can get a handful of good snaps from a guy like Leonard Taylor, I think he's worth keeping. So I'd like to see Leonard Taylor on the roster. Another thing, and this is a small thing, I think the Jets should keep a third quarterback. They went through much of last season with only 2 quarterbacks. Now they dabbled once they called Trevor Siemian up from the practice squad, but they entered last season with 2 quarterbacks on the roster, Aaron Rodgers and Zach Wilson. And I don't understand why you do that. I think in today's NFL, it just makes sense to have 3 quarterbacks on your active roster, from the standpoint that you essentially get a free active player every week who happens to be an emergency quarterback. In the NFL, you cannot activate all 53 of your players. And that's a weird rule. I think they all just ought to let teams activate all 53 of their players, but you cannot activate all 53 of your players. You can activate either 47 or 48, and that depends on how many offensive linemen are up, whether it's 47 or 48. But last year they instituted a new rule that you can designate one player. He has to be a quarterback who is eligible to go into games if your starting quarterback and backup quarterback get injured. And he does not count against your allotment of 47 and 48 players. So essentially he's a free active player. It's a critical free active player because if your top 2 quarterbacks go down, he can at least run an offense for you. And I know the response to this is going to be, well, you're in trouble if your top 2 quarterbacks go down. Yes, that's true. It's very difficult to win games with your third string quarterback. But I still think that there's a big difference between having a guy who's actually a quarterback versus sticking somebody like Garrett Wilson at quarterback. Garrett played quarterback in high school, but hasn't played it at a higher level. I still think there's a difference between sticking a real quarterback behind center and sticking a Garrett Wilson type. Because with the real quarterback, you can at least run some part of your regular offense. The third string quarterbacks aren't going to be able to do a whole lot, but you can at least function. You can at least design a few plays. I think I would probably lean more towards Adrian Martinez over Peasley, because Martinez can run, and we're talking about third string quarterbacks. Again, the playbook's going to be more limited. It's going to be look, the playbook's going to be bigger with Adrian Martinez than it will be with Garrett Wilson, but the playbook's going to be limited. But Martinez, allows you to build in a package of designed runs with the quarterback, some option plays, and maybe that can sustain itself over the short run. Maybe for a couple series, you can move the ball designing runs for Adrian Martinez. And if we're talking about your third string quarterback, I mean, the boom scenarios that you can design a few plays to keep you afloat for a couple series. I mean, that's really all you can ask for out of a third string quarterback. So I think the Jets should keep a number 3 quarterback. I'd lean more towards Martinez. I'm assuming Jordan Travis is not going to be activated. He's still on the non-football injury list. And, the vibes seem to be that he's not going to be activated anytime soon. So I'd like to see the Jets keep a third quarterback. And the last thing I'm going to say is this is something I've praised the Jets for in the past, and I think it probably will remain this way. I'd like to keep it this way. I like the fact that the Jets really do dedicate their last couple spots to special teams. And I think that's a really smart thing, because when you're talking about your number 6 receiver or your number 5 linebacker, you're not talking about a guy who's going to play a whole lot at his natural position. But your number 6 receiver or your number 5 linebacker, if they can contribute on coverage units, on special teams, they actually will play and they will make an impact. How many times do I give you this stat? During every day, you've heard it a lot. Around 1/5 of plays in the NFL come on special teams. If you have a special teams ace, it's worth keeping. I've seen some roster projections with the Jets keeping 7 receivers. And people say, why would you keep 7 receivers? Well, I don't view Irv Charles as a wide receiver, because he's not going to play wide receiver. I view him as a special teamer, kind of like when the Jets had Justin Hardy. He wasn't a corner. I mean, they list him as corner because the media refuses to just list guys as pure special teamers. But Justin Hardy's a special teamer. If Charles, a guy like him. There are a couple other guys on the roster who I think can help on special teams. And at the end of the day, if you get down to your number 6 receiver, if you get decimated by injuries, is Irv Charles really that much worse than whoever else you'd keep? I mean, I've seen some of the 7 receiver roster projections also have Jason Brownlee, which I don't really understand, because I don't think Brownlee can help you that much on special teams. I don't think he's that great of a wide receiver, but I think that there's a real logic behind what the Jets do. And I think, we talk a lot about the work Brant Boyer does, and rightly so. I think Brant Boyer has proven to be a very good coach with the Jets. He's been here since 2016. He's survived 2 head coaching changes. There's a reason for that. Brant Boyer's a quality coach, but I think part of the reason the Jets special teams are usually very good is they dedicate roster spots to find ace special teamers. I don't think you can sell that short. Boyer deserves credit, but so does the Jets front office for making smart moves by, keeping guys who are high quality special teamers. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to turn our attention forward, because today is roster cut day. But what comes after the Jets trim their roster to 53 men? The work's not over. We'll talk about what will come next, continuing here on this this Tuesday edition of Locked On. This is your Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. It is Cutdown day in the NFL. The Jets have until 4 p.m. Eastern to cut their roster down from 90 players to 53, but that's not the end of the story. The 53-man roster that you will see this afternoon, and it won't be exactly at 4 p.m. Eastern, because you have 32 teams that are cutting from 90 to 53 players down. So a lot has to be filed with the league. Usually it takes an hour or 2 after 4 p.m., after the official deadline, for us to get the first initial roster from the New York Jets. But you have to remember that this is probably not the final roster the New York Jets will have heading into week 1 against San Francisco. Usually there are some tweaks here or there. There's a player that they'll add. And that's because after today, there are around 1,200 players who are going to become available, because, again, there are cuts happening all across the league. Each team's got to trim from 90 to 53. So there are going to be players available, and the Jets may want 1 or 2 of them. Now, as mentioned in the last segment, I don't think teams, are aggressive enough as they should be with the waiver wire process. But there still will be some transactions. And if you're not familiar with how things work after Cutdown day, the next step is what's known as the waiver wire. And that deals with players who have less than 4 years of NFL experience. So if you are cut on Cutdown day and you have 4 years or more of NFL experience, you're just a free agent. You can sign with anybody. It doesn't make a difference. Your contract is null and void. You are free to sign with any of the other 31 teams. You're free to sign on practice squads. That's not true if you have less than 4 years of NFL experience. If you have less than 4 years of experience and you are cut on Cutdown day, you enter what's known as the waiver process. And the way the waiver process works is that the other 31 teams have a chance to claim you. the other 31 teams essentially have a chance to say, we want this guy on our team. And if one of the other 31 teams says, we want this guy on our team, they get him. And they take his current contract, just moves to the other team. He doesn't even need to sign a new contract. The current terms of his deal with his old team apply. So some players the Jets waive may be claimed by other teams. The Jets could claim players from other teams. Now, if more than one team claims a player, then the priority goes to the team that makes the claim that had the highest original draft pick in the 2024 NFL draft in the first round. So if 3 teams claim a player, if 31 teams claim a player, that player goes to whatever team claimed him that had the highest draft pick in the first round of the NFL draft this past year. And that's kind of a mechanism to try to help the bad teams get good. And it doesn't work like your fantasy football league. I know in your fantasy football league, if you're at the top of the waiver priority claim and you claim a guy, you go to the bottom. That's not the way it works in the NFL. In the NFL, until I think it's week 3 of the season, it's the waiver priority system is based on the order in which teams selected in the 2024 NFL draft. So, the worst team in the NFL last year has the best, has the highest. They can claim any guy they want. Then the second worst team has the second highest claim. The third worst team from last year has the third claim. And it's a mechanism to help the bad teams improve. It's a mechanism because the worst teams in the NFL theoretically need the most roster help. So if they want to claim somebody, the league sets it up so they can get him. After that point, and the waiver claims from today. So the initial waiver claims will be announced tomorrow at noon Eastern. So tomorrow at noon Eastern, everybody's got to make their cuts by 4 p.m. Eastern today. A lot of over 1,000 players will become available. The players who get claimed on waivers will be announced at noon tomorrow. And then there's going to be a second round of this because if the Jets claim a player, then they'll have to waive somebody else to clear a spot on the 53-man roster. So this is going to go forward for a couple of days. And from that point, teams are also able to start signing players to their practice squad. And the practice squad can be 16 to 17 players, depending on whether you participate in this program that utilizes international players. Some teams will have a 16-player limit. Some teams will have a 17-player limit. If you have a 17-player limit, you have to participate in this program, and one of the 17 needs to be an international player. And there are lots of there's lots of minutia about the practice squad rules and regulations. But after the waiver process completes, you can start signing players to your practice squad. Practice squad is essentially a group of players who practice with your team, but they're not on your 53-man roster. You can call up 2 players from your practice squad to activate them for game day each week without putting them on the roster, and there are other rules and regulations about that. Practice squad players do count against the salary cap, so there's no maximum salary for how much you pay a practice squad player, but they count against your salary cap. So you give them a big salary, then you're dealing with the cap. That's another thing that's important to remember as we talk about the practice squad. You can sign any free agent to your practice squad. Now, again, there are rules and regulations about how many of your players have this much experience, how many of your players have less than 1 year of service. There's a lot of minutia there, but free agent, you can sign any free agent to your practice squad. The Jets are not limited to players who spent training camp with them signing. When we're talking about players, they can sign to the practice squad. Jets can sign any free agent, whether they spent training camp with the Jets, whether they spent training camp with one of the other 31 teams, whether they weren't in training camp with anybody. If you're a free agent, you can sign to the practice squad. Again, there are certain rules and regulations about how many players have this much experience, how many players have that much experience. We'll get to that in a later show. It's not important to understand. And the other aspect to this is, while there's no requirement that the Jets there's no requirement that the Jets fill their practice squad with players who spent training camp with them. The reality is the Jets have shown an interest in the players who were in camp with them. The players who were in camp with them showed an interest in the Jets. So the majority of the practice squad probably will be players who spent training camp with the Jets, but that's not a requirement. Jets can sign anybody who's a free agent. As long as they're a free agent, either they have more than 4 years and were cut by their current team, or they have less than 4 years and no team claimed them off waivers. If nobody claims you on waivers, you become a free agent. You're free to sign with any team's active roster or practice squad. And that's kind of then the process begins and the fun begins. And we'll certainly keep an eye on what the Jets do on their roster. And tomorrow we'll talk about their decisions on their 53-man roster, but that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening, so let you know when there's an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Tuesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk about the Jets 53-man roster.